Darwin felt sure that his theory of descent with modification by means of natural selection would explain a lot about how the vast variety of life on the planet had come to be. But he also knew his idea was revolutionary, and he was not the type of person who welcomed a fight. So Darwin decided to do as much research as possible in search of data that might support or refute his theory before he would even consider publishing it. For example, how could he explain how new traits that give a survival advantage to an organism might arise in the first place? Where did the new traits come from? Darwin began to consult pigeon and dog breeders to find out what they knew about the passing of traits from one generation to another, and he even began his own experiments with pigeons. From this research, he came to see that each offspring of each generation would get a mixed set of traits from its parents. The parental traits might show up in varying degrees in each offspring, or sometimes a new and unexpected trait would appear. So traits were not passed on in some direct, exact copy way. Instead, there was a random shuffling of the deck in each new offspring, which sometimes involved totally unexpected mutations. Darwin came to believe that in every generation there was enough opportunity for some trait that had not been useful in the past or that had never even appeared before to become strengthened and circulated through a population if that trait was a good fit to the environment. Darwin now believed that new species often developed in this way. They might be new forms of older species that had been modified over time to adapt to environmental conditions, until the older form disappeared and the new one took its place. He saw that the Galápagos Islands were a good example of how this works because the newly formed volcanic islands way out in the Pacific Ocean didn't have any plants or animals on them not long ago in geological time. Therefore, the plants and animals he saw were probably descended from mainland plants and animals that had made it to the Galápagos and were modified by natural selection to fit the environmental conditions there. But Darwin had to show how plants and animals could get to the Galápagos in the first place. He started with plants. Darwin proposed the theory that seeds from the mainland drifted in water to the Galápagos, or were blown by the wind, or were carried in the belly of birds and deposited on the islands in bird droppings. To test this theory, Darwin soaked various seeds in salt water and in bird droppings for months, and then tried to grow plants from them. He found most seeds were not harmed by long exposure to salt water or bird droppings. That proved to Darwin that seeds could make it to the Galápagos and still produce healthy plants. What about animals? He knew birds might make it to remote islands such as the Galápagos by flying, but what about iguanas or tortoises? Darwin theorized that they arrived on the Galápagos on rafts of vegetation that sailors reported seeing caught in the currents that flow between the mainland and the Galápagos Islands. Darwin studied books about the ocean current that flows along the South American coast and out toward the Galápagos, and concluded that the currents were strong enough to carry iguanas and tortoises to the islands on vegetation rafts. As the years went by, Darwin continued to find evidence for his theory as he examined closely his notes on his voyage and as he conducted various experiments on breeding and began an intensive study of sea barnacles. By 1839, Charles had married his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, the daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, the same uncle who persuaded Charles's father to let Charles join the Beagle voyage. Darwin worried that publishing his ideas about natural selection would cause enough controversy that the good name of the Darwins and the Wedgwoods might be threatened. He also realized that most of the men of science he knew and respected were likely to object to his theories. Darwin's old friend, the Reverend Henslow, was a good example. Despite his devotion to science, Henslow was also a religious man who held that species could not change or transmute naturally, that each was a personal creation of God that could only change through the direct hand of God. But as Darwin became more and more convinced his theories were correct, he could not resist talking about them to a few other scientists. One of the first was a young botanist named Joseph Hooker. Darwin told Hooker,
"I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not, it is almost like confessing a murder, immutable. I think I have found out the simple way by which species become exquisitely adapted to various ends."
Hooker was impressed by Darwin's theory, but he was not convinced. It took some 15 years of argument and debate, and Hooker's own voyage of discovery to India, before Hooker finally came to accept the basic premise of Darwin's theory. In spite of private discussions with Hooker and a few others, Darwin had still not yet revealed his theory to the public, more than 20 years after returning to England from his Beagle voyage.